So basically the problem for a teacher is how to organize the chain between the composer's intent, the performer's understanding of the notation, which in part could betray the intent by the composer himself, herself. The misunderstanding in the loss in translation of the necessity of decoding the innuendos of the notation by the interpret with performer, student who comes in, and the hyphen being the teacher in between the composer and the student. But since the composer has died and it's in another time period, we have to restore the understanding of the whole musical world of the time in order to understand how to extract the meaning of the character, of the sonority, of the harmonic colorization, the mood, the atmosphere. And then comes the listener at the end of that chain, who is misled by the performer to perhaps like it in a way that the composer therefore didn't intend it, if it's misunderstood by the notation, which is a central pivotal situation where all the loss in translation starts or happens. In a way, thankfully so, because if the notation is so over-detailed that it doesn't allow for room to misinterpret or misunderstand, or perhaps newly re-understand it differently, and therefore create a new interpretation, which is the richness of beautiful music that played by, performed by, understood, heard differently by different people, even in different time periods within the same as well. It's like a gift that keeps on giving. It's a garden that you harvest and you obtain different kind of plants according to the different way you harvest your garden. But in order to penetrate the very intent of the composer's DNA of the thought before it's even notated, even before it's published, because then you also have the publishers who come in between, because you have for old music a lot of publishers who pretend to have the urtext, the original texts, but they compete in the original text knowledge of the composer. And some publishers are praised by some teachers who advise this or that edition to their students, or this competition directors prefer to advise to use this edition for their performance of the pieces of the competition. So you have all these intermediaries between the composer's intent and the listener, through the performer, who is in fact having only the score as a connection to the composer for most of them, because of the fact that we don't have recordings of their performances. And had we had ones, how do we know that the performance of the composer corresponds to the only way to be right? Perhaps the composer only imagined one way, which is his or her way, but then once he or she gives it to the world as a gift of welcome, then the people who like it say, I would like to play this piece, I would like to share with my audience, I need to express this because it shows my expression, and I can develop my virtuosity, or I can display the large array of my emotional content, which in fact I need this in a way to pull out of as from ingredients to make my own cooked meal to present to my audience, to share with. So in a way the composer then becomes a remote origin, and the oeuvre, the performers, become the composition. And then the recordings that exist over that lock in one interpretation and becomes the root for another, perhaps generation that will come to try to imitate it, saying, oh, I like Chopin played by Cortot, but what about I like better Chopin played by Lang Lang? And what if I only like Chopin played by Lang Lang, but by Cortot I don't like it? In fact, how much do I know Chopin before the performers came to play it for me, unless I have the time to learn it myself, which of course most people don't. And therefore they relate to performers who recite them the piece, and if they do it in a persuasive, emotional, driven, or any kind of way that the listener goes, oh, I love it, but they don't know how much of it is the performance of it, betrayed or enhanced or original of the thought of the composer, and sometimes you betray with love in order to bring something out that means to you more as a performer than perhaps it meant to the composer. Therefore, the truth and the search for the original intent of the composer to be purely translated directly in this chain to the performer, through the performer to the listener, is wrong. Because I don't think that is to do with truth, even if the ur-text for the publishers emphasizes the original text. I spend my life writing music. I spend my life spelling my name. I spend my life spelling my music. And I spend my life spelling what I think the composer's intent of the music is for students who trust me to give them an answer. And sometimes I have to answer with a question like philosophers, because I myself prefer to rephrase the question rather than to give a blunt answer, because inevitably the answer that you give is only colored by your own understanding, and regardless of how long I have studied or some other person studied and with whom you studied and for how long you studied, of course you can build a refined hearing, you can study it, you can shape it, you format it, you end up by cultivating your musicianship, either by curiosity or and by technique or trade, combined with the curiosity and the love for the music and the trade, and then all in a package you become an expressive promoter of the music that you want to convey, your own, if I'm like a composer, or the composer the music which is not yours, but through your playing or performing, it becomes partly yours, at least in the eyes of the listener, who is convinced that you are making it on the spot because you sound so convinced when you produce it. And they're almost puzzled, like in a good actor, you're not acting well. Good actors are good enough to erase their acting so you believe in their character rather than only analyze their acting of the character. It's all make-believe. But ultimately, if you can read directly in the intent of the composer, in the composer's psyche, in the composer's psychology, in the composer's emotional intent, some are obvious. If it's a happy music, it's a sad music, okay, it's a bit binary. But what if it's a fugue? What if a contrapuntal situation where it's a play on exchange of layered voice leadings, where you organize a certain word puzzle in a way, and you enjoy organizing the sounds so that they exchange harmoniously with each other, or sometimes collidingly, according to the expression you want to give, with the dissonances and the consonances. And so you through the music you play, or the music you compose, or your music you translate, or the music you transmit, whichever position in the chain you are placed in the music that you bring to the listener or to the spectator, if it's music for a video game or a film or a story, or just a background music by itself, or just music without any story, no narration, just the music itself, you address yourself to an intellect, to an emotional person also, and the culture of the listener will also filter it with their own understanding of what is a delayed realization of a harmonic tension to a release, what is a dissonance to a consonance, and what was a dissonance in the past and is consonant today, but appears dissonant, but then the audacity of some dissonance of the 18th century escapes us because we're so much connected to more dissonances today, which appear to us more blunt. And in a way, yes, you have to restore for the student as a teacher the soundscape of the time period, to extract the tension and the release in the harmonic colorization, and you have to find how to perceive not only intellectually, but through that to go to the sensorial way of understanding how you're manipulated in your psyche by the usage of the harmonic progressions. in different styles of tonal music through centuries of it that sound so different. Even they use the same rules of the 7/5 and the leading tone and the tritone and the tension and the release and the dissonance and the consonance and the major and the minor and the perhaps minor and the major and perhaps half major, half minor, and perhaps altered degrees, and perhaps manipulating these different, like Play-Doh, the different material to obtain something of a sculpture of their own, which speaks to you differently when you listen to Bach, Chopin, Mozart, Verdi, or because of the context also, if it's religious, if it's just an opera about intense human feelings and passions, and perhaps you connect to them because you see, oh, it talks to me because I feel these things. It's like reading a book by yourself, but it still talks to your psyche, and you can miss or understand it with the filter of your own knowledge or your own understanding. And of course, if it's translated from an original author, sometimes the translation can lead you to understand something different. So one single word placed differently, chosen differently by a translator, makes you understand a foreign author differently as a reader. Imagine a different interpreter as a performer translating to you something that you don't have access to unless you can read music yourself, in which case you bypass the performer and you just go to read the music itself. But then somehow, like an actor who brings to life a character that is written in the imagination of a writer, you bring to life the music that is codified in the score of a composer's thought. And sometimes the problem is that the composers at the root, at the very root of the problem, is that they don't notate exactly what they hear innerly, or they can't, or they bypass some of the subtleties of the complexities that come together with the thought process, or the notational thought process from the intuitional process of hearing a melody in their head, or a harmonization, and then they try it on the piano or another instrument, a guitar, something, and they think, oh, what if I do this? And then the process of amelioration comes into having, a rough draft and 700 other drafts until you reach some kind of extraction of your thought and say, oh, this is my final draft, like this is the best chapter I wrote because I cleared it up from this and that redundancy and this and that and that. In fact, is learning the grammar of music in order to read the music, but in order to hear it also, because you can misguess, mishear, misunderstand, misguide. Unfortunately, that is the most biggest danger for me, is to not misguide a student, because a student also doesn't come as an open book and says, okay, just teach me and I'll imitate you. Because that is not teaching, it's cloning, or perhaps at a certain extent, perhaps training, like you train an animal. But you could also train a musician technically, and you could spoon feed a musician to appear to be musical, but musicality is not something only in the intuition, it's also in the grammar of the knowledge. You speak a mother tongue by ear because of your birth, and you reproduce the sounds by ear, and then you read them when you grow up, and then you rewrite them, and then you learn the grammar, and you learn that what you are saying, without to know how you are saying it, has a certain order of the words, and so you start becoming and understanding and cultivated locutor. You speak, you write, you think, you develop ideas, you transmit ideas, you die. And between the birth and the death, you have developed something that you received into something that you leave. And for people who will come after you to read you, misunderstand you, or perhaps set you on a song or on a stage, on an opera, on a film, on a video game, adapt you to a different technology in order to promote what they think is necessary to bring to the audience, because the audience is what? Is us. The performers are the audience in music, and the audience is the performer. We share between the producer, the composer, and the performer in between, and the student inside, but the listener at the end. spectator, listener, reader, the people to whom you destine your emotional content or intellectual content as a creator. And then operas are written out of it, or films are made out of it. And of course, in the development of the film, the script is transformed because it has to fit the technology or the time constraint. And sometimes the constraints make you do different type of poems with different types of rhymes, because you read and you learn how to write poems. You don't start speaking in verse, you speak in prose, and you learn how to write in verse, and perhaps you can end up by thinking in verse. But this is exactly what it is when you're a musician and you learn a language, which music is through the grammar, but also through the intuition of the sounds. And you're faced as a teacher today to teach music from 6, 8, 9, 10 centuries, more or less clearly notated, less than more, at least to our understanding. And of course, you have niche knowledgeable people who study specifics about how to translate and not to misunderstand the notation through an instrumentarium, or is it because of the music itself and the intervals and the voice leading and the rules of behaving between voice leading and layered organization of if you sing with 8 parts and 14 singers, or if you sing with 10 parts, or if you play it all with your fingers in chromaticisms, or in different tunings, or you obtain different effects if it's in major and minor, or with different semitones, quarter tones, and sometimes even eighth of tones. And sometimes you reach the point where you can hear music extracted from its context, and you translate it into another context. You play music written by a composer like Bach on the piano that he didn't have with pedals, that he didn't have to hold the sounds, but with which they hold sounds that he indicated in his notation, even if they are meant to be there as indications rather than realizations of the hearing it. And when you see it in the published edition, if it takes down all the details of the notational systems of the past, then you misunderstand it when it's played literally today. So it's a literal translation, in fact, betrays the ideas like false cognates between languages, where you think the sound is the same in the translation of a word, and you go, oh, that's the same. And of course, well educated, you know it's not. And then you can play on these directions, or these diversions, or this, in fact, beautifully, playfully almost, cunningly also playing the oppositions and make it make believe. You think I'm in this, but in fact it's that, and the listener is charmed by hearing this seemingly magical translations. A lot of this comes from the harmonic language, therefore the grammar. And of course, if you learn the language first by the ear and then into the grammar as a child does, or if you learn a foreign language as an adult through the grammar into the speaking, you have an accent in the foreign language from your own, because your ear is shaped according to the phonemes that you grew up around. And so it's okay, but you can at least speak in another language that is written. Then you read the writing of the other language, and you might be crying or be emotionally driven or intellectually is mesmerized by reading a philosophy in another language, because somebody's thoughts connect through their language. The composer like Schumann is intrinsically German in his music and in the intellect of his own, because of his love for literature and of Germany of his time. Of course, that's not Debussy, and you cannot say it is the same just because it's classical music. That's people who don't know that say that because they don't really want to know. But once they love a pattern of details, that they can go so much in details, like let's say pop music versus, I don't know, for non-knowledgeable people in pop music, two pop music bands are sounding alike, but the connoisseurs will let you know that's no way. And there's no, you cannot compare at all the style of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and therefore you cannot compare Ravel and Debussy or Bach and Handel, and people say, oh, it sounds all the same to me. If you don't know, it's like a foreign language, you don't understand the meaning, you only listen to the music of the words. And you misunderstand the intent because you think, oh, there are more consonants that collide, that must be more angry, or there are more vowels and you don't hear consonants. You think, oh, that's very cool and relaxed, but perhaps in fact the meaning of it is not connected to the sounds. And since you don't know the meaning, you only listen to the sounds and you try to make a meaning out of the sounds. But that doesn't make a meaning. It just gives you a charm of the sounds. And you hear a language with more vowels, a language more consonants, or different combination of the diphthongs, etc. So putting a meaning in the hearing is like putting a meaning in the reading, and you can substitute the meaning of the author with your own understanding, and you can also implement it more. You can enhance it. You can say, I understand him better than himself. Like, who would have this lack of humility to say, I understand Bach better than Bach himself? But at some point when you study his music, you love his music, or because you love it, you study it. By studying it, you develop a knowledge that becomes so much more in-depth for a given composer than others, like for an author or for a filmmaker, and you end up becoming a specialist because you feel like this is a micro world, a microcosm in which you are so comfortable, because this is the world in which you feel like you correspond, because you don't have all these mysteries of what does it mean or what could it mean. I don't know what it means. Perhaps I think it means this, but in fact it's not. So sometimes it's beautiful as a teacher to hear a performer play a piece which in fact is denaturated from its what we think original intent of the composer, but becomes a beautiful piece on its own, separated from the intent of the composer. The listener might not be able to know that this is happened, but it's okay. I think it's the richness of the, or perhaps the weakness of the detailed notation that leads to the, or opens the options to infinite, so that you can have, I don't know, 800 pianists play 800 times the given famous piece of a given composer, and you might hear it many, many times very differently. Not just because it's fast or slow or loud or soft, not the easy ones, parameters, but the subtle parameters, the ones about the delay between a note because of an intent that is realized or not, a leading tone that is avoided to go to its tonic, or something that makes you understand the innuendos. And some actors bring innuendos differently from different actors doing the same role. And you say, oh, who chooses? Of course, at the end, the director chooses who is actor who will best embody the character of the play or the writing or of the thoughts of the author. Same way for music. And I find it fascinating because I do not want to appear with students that because I'm older and I have been through studies before them, by the generational fact, that makes me more knowledgeable only because I have more experience. Yes, experience is what they come for because they don't have it, but in order to build their own and make their own experience become their own tradition, which then they'll transmit in turn. And with time, we think that we are reaching some levels of truth which we want as teachers to sort of rigidify and say, this is how it's supposed to be. It's not wrong. It's wrong to do this way. It's not supposed to be that way. And then in those innuendos, in the rubato for the tempo, in the harmonization delay, in the pedaling, which smears, which doesn't, how do you delay a meaningful expression that is psychologically delaying the meaning or preparing the meaning or over-enhancing the meaning? Sometimes it becomes a redundancy. To recite it simply is not enough. To overstate it with your character, personality, and to overcoat it into your through the filter of what you understand of it is also in a way belittling the origin of the piece, which is the composer's intent in the music. So you have to sort of be a transparency over the composer's thought, and at the same time add your layer of understanding. and you try to espouse the understanding and the meaning and the feeling that you establish with the composer's piece, more than the composer, him or herself, is the piece itself with which you deal, and which you're trying to shape like a sculptor until you find the most. So let less when you're the composer and the piece doesn't exist before you, and so you come up with writing it from scratch out of your mind or thought or dreams, or as I like to say, composing is almost like sight reading from memory. It's like as if you retrieve from your memory the piece that is already there, but it has to be reshaped exactly to come out as it is. Chopin did it on the keyboard. Mozart used to say that he never sketches, but it sketches in his mind, but doesn't need to write drafts before to get the final draft. To the contrary of composers like Beethoven and others who drafted endlessly until they extracted the essence of their thought. With more effort to do so in the process than in others. Some authors are more natural and just come up with the most unbelievably unforgettable melody that takes your heart like a perfume or a beautiful gaze, and you go, oh God, I love it. And you don't know why. And you shouldn't decorticate and I can imagine why, because this or that. And if I reproduce this interval and this, I'll make also one like that. But it doesn't work. The ingredients don't make the food in music. The combination are very personal to the composer, and so when you're the performer, you just transmit it, but you receive it first before you transmit it. In this transmission process, the teacher is sort of the lawyer on behalf of the estate of the composer's thoughts, and who the student trusts that the teacher knows or or feels right or knows right, or perhaps both. But when you compose, it comes out of nowhere into becoming a piece of its own that becomes the truth itself. But that truth is relative, like all truths. And when the performer meets the composer, then the composer becomes a little bit less clear about the intent. I should have notated it this way. I shouldn't have put this tempo. I shouldn't have written this phrasing, because it induces to other this and that. So by hearing it played, the composer realizes that it could be misunderstood the way he wrote it. So he'll say, let me rephrase it, so to say, in writing. But ultimately, there will never be a moment where the music will be locked in the thought of the composer. It has to go through the perhaps forever changing, beautifully so, ephemerally so sometimes, interpretational constructions, as if the performer is a sculptor of sand castles on the beach, and the composer is the wave. Then you build again it's erased. And then other interpretations come and you rebuild it differently. And little by little you try to find patterns of how to rebuild it so it's less prone to be erased by the wave. As students, sometimes they say, I just played it so well in my practice room yesterday or this morning, and now it doesn't come out again. You have to rebuild it from scratch, even if it's written in a way codified through the notation, which is a codification, but you filter it through so much processes of intent, intuition, intellect, obedience, of studying, learning, curiosity that brings you to understand how it's supposed to be done, or how it used to be done, and how we think it used to be done, since most of the music of today is played by composers from yesterday or way before yesterday. Within their own time frame, the performers played the music of their own time, so the corrections happened in real time. All the performers were composers, and anyway, they corrected it in real time if there were discrepancies in the copying of the score, since they didn't have any computer or anything. So there was prone to also a lot of misunderstandings, but within the same time zone, same time frame of the same time place, I think they managed to not betray the thoughts. But when we love a piece and we think we love it by betraying it, it becomes almost a guilt. Because, I like it more my way, even if it's not supposedly the way or his way. I think it's always the beautiful gift of the essence that comes in the piece, that the student makes their own, and it becomes their own way. And the teacher evaporates and leaves the student who becomes a master and then translates it to the next generation. So the written text is sort of like a sidekick thing, because in fact it's all what you can say and read and understand about it that is more than only what is written on it. It's puzzling and humbling and extremely humbling, a matter of fact. That no matter how much you think you develop the knowledge, the least you know. The more you learn, the more you know, the least you understand, or the more you understand the abyssal amount of options that are open to you, which perhaps, if one remains at the level of blissful ignorance, one in fact doesn't even notice them existing, all these hidden worlds that are there. Once you explore them, you can drown in them. And so I think the role of the teacher is to guide, not to stifle, not to be a model to be imitated, but to guide the student to rediscover by themselves with these guiding rules that you transmit to them, and then take off the scaffolding and the student flies on their own, keeping more or less of what you taught them, probably less than more, but that's okay. For the ego it's tough, but it's important to not overemphasize the transmission only, but the purpose of the transmission, which is the new creation that comes through the new performance, through the new generation. And sometimes it's beautiful to see, not some, all the time, that younger generations then, they see things that I didn't see, that perhaps my teachers didn't see in this masterpiece that we all serve, because the text was there before us, the text will be there after us for the next generations. They all wonder, how do I play it? How do I finger it? How do I breathe it? How do I sing it? How do I understand it? How do I translate it? What tempo, what feeling, but how much, but not too much, but a little, but there, but where, but why, but how often, and not all the time, but just here and there, and how you space and how you don't, because it's not notated. It's intended, at least for convincing a convert is easy, but when you have to create the whole route to build and harvest your own understanding of the microcosm in which you will place that piece that you serve. Yeah, the muse is sometimes cruel with us, because we think we serve her right, and in fact sometimes we are, through the students, given a mirror to ourselves that we didn't. And in fact they did understand it better than us, because they applied their own shortcuts, which led them to a place where it's more clear, and all of a sudden you have to accept it, even if, as I said, sometimes it's tough to take for the self-esteem. It keeps you humble. Perhaps humor helps. But it gives the whole meaning of being alive. Transmit. Thank you.